All right, Shabbos, good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul. Avraham Shaindy Kelman for dedicating all of the shiurim and droshos this month in memory of their parents. Our week of learning sponsors, Ilan Alyse Roth, in honor of joining the shul as a married couple. They are looking forward to being part of our shul community, and we are excited to welcome them. To thank our Daf Yomi sponsors, Melanie Milton Gertner, in honor of the birth of a granddaughter, to Shelley and Bobby Dolitsky, Esther Fruma. And as this baby arrived in this world a little bit early, please continue to keep her in your tefillos and to daven for a refuah sheleima for Esther Fruma, Bas Shoshana Tova. She should have a refuah together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. So with that, let us begin. We have a very exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Beis 42. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on 41b, Mem Aleph Amud Beis, and we left off. We'll pick up Lamli the Meimar 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, about 14 lines up from bottom. So also remember again, the Gemara was telling a story about Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azai, Rabbi Akiva, who were coming on a boat, and there was only one lulav. Only one lulav. So if you remember again, the Gemara brought down that story to illustrate the idea that although there is an obligation of lachem, of exclusive ownership of your lulav on the first day of Yom Tiv, one could accomplish that through the mechanism of a matana. So if I own my lulav, and I go ahead and I convey ownership of that lulav to you, that satisfies the criteria of lachem for you. Not only that, but even if you give what's called a matana al menas lahachzir. So I go ahead and I give a gift with the express intention that you have to give me back the item. You have to give me back the item. So halacha l'maisa matana al menas lahachzir will work as well. The Gemara then goes on, Lama liba meimar shalakho be'elav zuz. By the way, why do you have to say that Rabbi Gamliel bought the lulav for 1,000 zuz? By the way, Maishi told me yesterday, I guess he did his Google conversions, it's about $2,500. Right? So imagine spending $2,500 on your lulav in esrog. Right? So again, I want to point out, one is not even mechuyev to do such a thing like that. So why does the Gemara have to say that halacha l'maaseh Rabbi Gamliel spent 1,000 zuz? Lahodiacha kama mitzvos chavivos alehen, in order to show you how precious mitzvos were to these individuals. So again, it's very important. The Gemara is not telling us how much we need to spend on mitzvahs. The Gemara is not teaching us a halacha. The Gemara is teaching us a hashkafa. How important are mitzvahs to you? You know, say, everyone in life has things that are important to them, and on those things, I'll spend money. Well, whatever those things may be. Some people like clothing, some people like vacations, some people like wine, some people like houses. Whatever is important to you is what you spend money on. So the fact that Rabbi Gamliel was willing to spend such an exorbitant amount of money on the lulav and esrog indicates how important mitzvahs were, which in general is an interesting hashkafas hachayim, that whatever you're willing to really spend money on ultimately is reflective of your value system in life. You spend money on the things that are important to you. So it's interesting sometimes if we take a step back and look at our lifestyle, what is it that I spend the most amount of money on, and is that truly reflective of my value system? An incredible yisod. So this is very beautiful. Mar bar Amemar said to Ravashi, Abba, my father, so this is Mar bar Amemar. So Mar bar Amemar's father is Amemar. My father Amemar, so tsaluye kamasli bey. He would daven holding his lulav and esrog. So listen to this. In other words, so as opposed to us, right? So we go ahead, usually pick up our lulav and esrog by halal, right before halal. So apparently Amemar would daven the entire time. Rashi says, Masli bey kishaya mispala hayululavo biyado mirov chibasa lo hayimispala bo. Because Amemar was so just in love with his lulav, right? Was so in love with the mitzvah, he held it the entire time. So the Gemara says, is that mutter meisvei lo yochaz adam tefillin biyado v'sefer Torah b'cheiko. A person should not hold tefillin, or should not hold the Sefer Torah, while he is davening. While he's davening. If you look at Rashi says, why not? Lo yochaz adam v'yispalel, mipnei shetarutu b'machshavto, shelo yiplu miyado, v'yizbazu, ve'in daito miyusheves ala b'tulaso. It's actually interesting halach in general. One is not supposed to hold something when they daven. That's also something. Why? The logic is when you're holding something, very often there's a mental preoccupation. That's what? You don't want to drop it. You don't want to drop it and ultimately cause it to be damaged. So therefore, again, the Gemara says a person should not hold tefillin, should not hold the Sefer Torah when he is davening. Why? Mental preoccupation. It'll detract from your kavanah during davening. The Gemara just adds in other halachas. V'lo yashtin bahen mayim. A person should not go ahead and urinate while wearing tefillin, while holding the Sefer Torah. V'lo yishan bahen, shouldn't sleep wearing tefillin. We saw this before. Lo shinas kev, lo shinas harai. Not a longer sleep, a shorter sleep. V'amar Shmuel, and Shmuel said, sakin, holding a knife, uka'ara, holding a plate or a platter, kikar, a loaf of bread, ma'os, money, hari elu ki yotze bahen. So these items are just like a Sefer Torah and tefillin. In other words, don't carry anything. Don't carry anything. You shouldn't hold anything while you're davening, so because it could detract or distract from your, well, it could detract from your kavanah. So how could a meimar hold the lulav the entire davening? Boss, this is a beautiful answer. Hasam lav mitzvah ninhu. See, Rabbi say what the Gemara is describing over there is there's no mitzvah to hold the Sefer Torah. There's no mitzvah to hold tefillin. There's no mitzvah to wear tefillin. There's learned from the Torah. No mitzvah involved in the holding of these objects. Certainly no mitzvah involved in holding a knife or in holding a platter. Therefore, again, Abba said, v'tarid b'hu. Therefore, because these items do not serve a mitzvah function, or in other words, the holding of these items does not serve a mitzvah function, they are considered to be a distraction. Hacha, over here by Lulav and Esrig, mitzvah ninhu v'lo tarid b'hu. Ultimately, again, these items are a mitzvah, and therefore, lo tarid means a person is not preoccupied, they're not a distraction. Now, what does this mean? This is actually quite beautiful. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, lav mitzvah ninu, lo ochzan, v'hadyun alav lemasa, lefichach tar b'masa, v'kaved alav masa'am ushmirasam. Shabbos says, so ultimately, again, holding a Sefer Torah, holding tefillin, holding a knife, holding a platter, there's no mitzvah involved in these things. So because there's no mitzvah, therefore Rashi says, it's a masa. It's considered to be a burden, right? It's just an item. And because it's an item, a person is preoccupied that he does not want to drop and cause a loss to the item. What's different by lulav? So the Gemara says lulav is a mitzvah. Rashi says it's so beautiful. Rashi says, nitilasa ulikichasa mitzvahi. Ultimately, again, the taking of the lulav, right? What he says, nitilasa, the taking of it, ulikichasa. So also there's nitilasa and likichasa. So apparently, again, nitilasa means the initial act of taking it. Likichasa means what? Having it with you on an ongoing basis. That's all part of the mitzvah, which I will say, first of all, is really quite fascinating, because in general, we normally assume that what happens with lulav and esrog, you pick it up and what? You make a bracha and you don't say, I'm done. Do my nanuim, do my shek, and I'm done. You see from Rashi, you see from the Gemara over here, that there's two elements of the mitzvah. There's al netilas lulav, which is why we make the bracha of al netilas lulav. The mitzvah, the ikr mitzvah, is the taking. But then there is a mitzvah to keep the lulav with you. To keep the lulav with you. And therefore Rashi says something so beautiful. Umitoch shechaviva mitzvah alav, because the mitzvah is so near and dear to me, ein masa v'shimura kaved alav v'lo tarid. The act of holding the lulav is not considered to be a masa. It's not considered to be a burden. Therefore, there's no preoccupation, so to speak, v'lo tarid. And therefore, again, I'm not preoccupied. So we'll say what comes out is as follows. Two things. So the Gemara essentially is teaching me like this. You can't hold on to something that has the status of a masa, of a burden. Because if something has the status of a burden, right, of something that you have to schlep around, even if it's an important item, like a Sefer Torah, tefillin, right, anything that's a masa, I'm preoccupied with that I don't want to drop it, and therefore that'll detract from my kavanah during davening. Rashi says something so beautiful over here. A mitzvah because it's beloved onto an individual is not a masa. A mitzvah is never a masa. A mitzvah is never a burden. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, there is no mental preoccupation. Why is there no mental preoccupation? Because they're both saying, if you think about it like this, a mitzvah and tefillah is chad inyani. It's one thing. Right? What's the goal of tefillah? What's the goal of tefillah? It's not to get what you want. That's not the goal of tefillah. The goal of tefillah is connection with the Ribbon Shalom. It's a dialogue. I'm talking to Hashem. That's the goal. Connection. I just want to come closer. I come closer to someone or to something by conversing with it. I'm talking with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's the goal of a mitzvah? Connection with Hashem. So therefore, again, a mitzvah is not a masa. A mitzvah is chaviva. A mitzvah is beloved. And because it's beloved, it's not a masa. Holding these other things as important as they are, right? Tefillin is important. Ultimately, I can say for Torah is important. But at the end of the day, these are not mitzvahs. Meaning holding on to them is not mitzvahs. Therefore, it's a masa. So we'll say, so on a halachic level, the only thing you can't hold on to over the course of davening is something that is deemed a masa. A mitzvah is not deemed a masa. And on a hashkafic level, a very beautiful, beautiful yesod. The Rebbe said, because a mitzvah is chaviva, by definition, it's not a masa. Right? And isn't that our ikar avoda in life? To make sure that our mitzvahs, that our avodas Hashem is always chaviva, and never a masa. Such an incredible yisod. So the Gemara backs up this idea, by the way, and now, by the way, Rashi also introduced us to this idea, that two elements to the mitzvah of lulav. There is nitilasa and likichasa. The initial taking, al nitilas lulav, and then there is the ongoing keeping the lulav with you. Also, listen to how beautiful this is. Tanya, Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadik Omer, this was the minhag of the men of Yerushalayim. Listen to this. Adam yotzi mi beiso, vilu lavo biyado. Person will leave his house, and where do you go when you leave your house? You take your lulav with you. Holich labeis hakneses, lulava biyado. You went to shul, right? So first of all, you'd walk out of your house holding your lulav. Okay, that's not such a chiddush. We do that also, right? So I walk out of my house, I'm holding my lulav. I go into shul, lulava biyado. Kore kriyashma, mispalo, lulav biyado. Both say this is very interesting. Unlike us, who only take lulav, like I said before, by Hallel, the minhag of Anshe Yerushalayim is that they would be holding their lulav already from the beginning of davening. From the beginning of davening. Kriyashma, lulav, Shmona Esrei, lulav, Kore batorah, Venose eskapov. However, when they would get an aliyah, or a Kohen who was duchening, manicho al gabi karka. They would put the lulav down, which is actually very interesting. So the duchening, I understand, because the Kohen has to lift his hands and spread his fingers. What about the Kori Batorah? So the Kori Batorah is very interesting. From here you see the post coming down, from here you see the Rosh comments on this, that when you get an aliyah, you have to hold on to the sefer. Right, so because you have to hold on to the sefer, you have to go ahead and put your lulav and esrog down. Listen to this: Holech levakir cholim ulenachim avelim. If you go to do bikur cholim, or you go to do nichum avelim, you go to pay a shiva visit, lulavo biyado. Isn't that interesting? Right, you might get some interesting looks from the hospital staff when you walk in at the sign-in desk. But lamaisa, I take that back. This is Yerushalayim, right? Such a gullus mentality. Right? So you walk in, you do nichum. Now also, I will tell you what's very interesting about this Gemara is there any nichum avelim on Yom Tiv? No. So this is actually an interesting discussion over here. That there is, remember again, one of two scenarios. If somebody died before Yom Tiv and they're sitting Shiva, Yom Tiv comes along and cuts off the Shiva. If someone died over the course of Yom Tiv, Shiva is delayed ultimately till after Yom Tiv. So it's whatever so Nichum Avelim could also just simply mean lav dafka, real Nichum Avelim, like paying a Shiva visit, but it can mean you're going to sit with someone who suffered a loss. Okay, Nichnas LaBeis HaMedrash, person goes into the Beis HaMedrash, listen to this. Mishager lulavo biad bino biad avdo biad shlucho. When you go to learn, you put your lulav down. You go to learn, right? You go, you give your lulav to your son, to your servant, to your agent. Ultimately, also, which is really fascinating. Why? Because when it comes to learning, you have to give learning your undivided attention. as much as lulav is not a masa, and you could even hold it during davening, learning requires a heightened level of attentiveness. That even with a mitzvah that's not a masa, put it down. Put it down. It's such an incredible yisod. So for Shema, I could hold my lulav. For Shemona Esrei, I could hold my lulav. But it comes to the essential, I come to learn that I have to try to be as distraction-free, which makes sense, because at the end of the day, to carry on a dialogue I could do with a lulav, to learn up a piece of Gemara, to kind of hold cup, in the midst of svara, that I need attentiveness for. That really needs my undivided attention, which is probably one of the greatest challenges right today of doing anything in life without distraction, is incredibly complicated. But you see over here, Anshe Yerushalayim would even put down their beloved Lulav and Esrog for the sake of learning. My Kamash Malon, why is this being quoted over here? Lahodi'acha kama hayuzrizin b'mitzvahs. Because it teaches us, it highlights to us how zor is the Anshe Yerushalayim were with their mitzvahs, that mamish, they would carry around the Lulav and Esrog the entire time. So beautiful. Rabbi Yossi Omer Yom Tov. So let's remember again, Rabbi Yossi said in the Mishnah that halacha l'maisa, if a Yom Tov, first a Yom Tov that falls out on Shabbos, and you forgot and you carried your lulav out into Rosh Hashanah, so Rabbi Yossi held that halacha l'maisa, you're potter because you are misasek b'mitzvah. You are preoccupied with the performance of a mitzvah, and that preoccupation exempts you from a chatos for having carried in Rosh Hashanah. To which the Gemara says, Amar Abaye says, top of Membeis, Lo shanu ela shelo yotza bo. That's only true. Rabbi Yossi says, if you did not yet fulfill the mitzvah, aval yotza bo chayiv. But I will say, for example, if you were already yotzi the mitzvah of lulav, and what? And then you carried it out, you can't say that you're misasek b'mitzvah. Now remember, you could be misasek b'likichasa. But where do you perform the ikar mitzvah of lulav? Right when you pick it up. Well, actually, I'm jumping ahead. So the Gemara says, if you go ahead and you already fulfilled the mitzvah, you would be chayiv for accidentally carrying it out into Shoshana Shabbos. The Gemara says, 1 second. Once you go to the mitzvah, hamida'ag bei nafik bei. But how then do you ever have a case, according to Rabbi Yossi, where you would be pater from liability? Why? When are you yotzi the mitzvah of dalad minim? When? As soon as you pick it up. But it says, Amar Abaye, kisha havcho. You picked it up upside down, which is very interesting. You picked it up upside down. So the Gemara says, I will say now, interestingly enough, the upside down, when you look at the Rishonim over here, so the Rishonim say that this could very well be the lulav that they're talking about. Now the truth is, we know our minhag is to take the esrog upside down, because we know that this is the halacha. This probably sparks an entire discussion. The notion that you can go ahead and as soon as you pick up your lulav and esrog, if you pick everything up right side up, you automatically yotze the mitzvah. Now, why is that problematic? If you automatically yotze the mitzvah, what does it pose a problem for? The bracha, right? I can't make a bracha on a mitzvah if I've already been yotzei the mitzvah. So that's why we go ahead and we dafka pick up the esrog upside down. So Tosfos points out over here, again, we don't have time to get into it, that you see from something very interesting, which is mitzvos inon tzrichos kavana. That you see a mitzvah doesn't require kavana to discharge the obligation, doesn't require specific intent. Because if a mitzvah required kavana, I can lift up my lulav and esrog, right, and just not have kavana to be yotzei yet. So you see from the fact that you're automatically yotzei, the mitzvahs don't even need kavana. Fine. So therefore, again, we have this concept of we lift up the esrog upside down. I'm just pointing out, in the Gemara's model, it's possible that they're talking about the lulav upside down. It doesn't really matter what you hold upside down. It could be lulav, it could be the esrog, it could be you. Whatever it is, as long as something is upside down, right, you're not yotzei the mitzvah immediately. So that could be a case, according to Rabbi Yossi, where you picked it up, you're not yotzei the mitzvah, and then as you walk out, you have everything right side up. That's called misasek b'mitzvah. Rava says, Rava says, no, it could even be a case where you're holding the esrog or the lulav right side up. Hachama asking on what's the case? He goes show tzil bekli. Oh, interestingly enough, the case is where you're holding the lulav and esrog in a utensil. And therefore you're not immediately yotzei the mitzvah. So we had this daf, I think this was Shabbos' daf, that lekicha al yidei davar acher. That let's say again, you take your lulav and esrog, and you're not holding it, for example, you wrap your lulav in a piece of silk, or you wrap your hands in a piece of silk, that ultimately, again, you're still yotzei. So even taking the lulav in a kli, one should still be yotzei. Hanimili derech kavod. That's only true if you're taking the lulav derech kavod. In other words, that the item that you're taking the lulav with is something bakavadik. Rashi says kigon besudar shekorech yada besudar, like a cloak or a piece of silk. But a kli al derech bizayon lo. But I will say, if you were, let's say, for example, I'll give you the good example of this. Let's say your lulav is in its holder, right? And you hold the lulav and you hold the esrog. You're not yotzi the mitzvah like that. It's the kicha al yedei davar acher. That's not called derech kavod. When Rava says that you could be yotzei with yikicha ayidei davar acher, taking the lulav with like an intermediary, that's only true if that intermediary adds kavod to the mitzvah. You wrap the lulav in a piece of silk. So you're not holding the lulav directly, but ultimately, again, that's still called the lekicha. But taking it in a kli, you won't be yotzei. Amar Rav Huna, Omer hay Rabbi Yossi, olas ha'of shenim. So therefore, again, this is the sheet of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi holds that when you are misasik b'mitzvah, if you inadvertently violate an avera in the midst of the performance of a mitzvah, that exempts you from liability for that avera. Good. So the Gemara says another example of this. Omer Afuna, Omer Hai Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi gives another example of this, and actually a very interesting case. He says, Olas ha'of shenimtseis bein agafayim. So here's the case. You have an olas ha'of, right, an ola bird that was found in a pile of chatas birds. Now these are all slaughtered birds, right? So remember again, a kohen is permitted to eat a chatas, not permitted to eat an ola, right? An ola is fully consumed on a mizbeach. So here's the case. So the kohen goes ahead and finds an ola bird in the midst of a pile of chatas birds, and because the ola bird is next to the chatas birds, the kohen assumes that what? Ukisavar chatas ha'uf hi va'achla. So the kohen understandably assumed that the ola bird was actually a chatas bird because it was in a pile with other chatas birds, and therefore he eats the ola bird. So the consumption of an ola is an avera. So what's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, Rabbi Yossi says the kohen is pater. The kohen is pater. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malon." So what's the chiddush over here? The ta'a b'dvar mitzvah pater. So again, I will say here, the kohen is ta'a b'dvar mitzvah. Right? What is ta'a b'dvar mitzvah? He made a mistake in the course of a performance of a mitzvah. He thought that he was consuming a chatos, which is a mitzvah, but instead he made a mistake. He didn't consume a chatos. Instead, what did he consume? An ola. And therefore Rabbi Yossi says, anytime you make a mistake in the course of the performance of a mitzvah, you are pater. You are pater. So the Gemara says, Hainu hach. Okay, it's the same case. In other words, it's a different example, but it's the same principle. No different than walking out into Shurab Ban Shabbos holding your lulav and esrog. Rabbi Yossi said, you're pater because you're misasik b'dvar mitzvah. So why do you have to bring this case as well? Ma'adatema, what would you have said? Hasam hu de ta b'dvar mitzvah pater hainu da'avid mitzvah. Maybe Rabbi Yossi says that ta b'dvar mitzvah, if you make a mistake in the course of the performance of a mitzvah and you inadvertently commit an avera, you're going to be pater. That's only when you actually performed a mitzvah, like the case of lulav and esrog. Well, so what's the case of lulav and esrog? It's Shabbos, first day Sukkah. I go ahead and I'm so excited taking a lulav and esrog that what happens? I lift it up, walk out of my house, and not even realizing it, transfer my lulav from my home Rosh Hashanah into the street Rosh Hashanah. Isser da'araisa. Rabbi Yossi says you're pater from liability. Aser, but you're pater from liability. There's no liability there. Why? Because you were preoccupied with the performance of a mitzvah. Maybe Rabbi Yossi only holds that there's a p'tur in a situation where you actually performed the mitzvah. So in the case of lulav, you actually performed the mitzvah. In the case of the consumption of the ola bird, did you perform a mitzvah? No. There was no mitzvah that was performed there. Aval hacha, the tabed var mitzvah, for lo avad mitzvah. In the case of the chatas bird, true, you made a mistake. But not only did you make a mistake, you actually didn't perform any mitzvah. Emalo, I would have thought that maybe halacha lemaisa, you're not pater. Kamash malon, you are. Kamash malon, Rabbi Yossi has a broader definition. And he holds ta b'dvar mitzvah means, if you made a mistake in the actual performance of a mitzvah, or in what you thought was the performance of a mitzvah, you will be exempt from liability. So Meisvei Rabbi Yossi Omer Hashoche, the Esatam Shelim Avokar Kilchas B'Shabbos Chayiv Chatos V'Tzarech Tamid Acher. So the Gemara says in an interesting case, if a person shechts a tamid that was not mevukar kilchasa, and Abba said the halacha is that a tamid, a carbon tamid, have to be taken from a particular pen in the Beis HaMikdash called the Lishkas Hatlan. We learned this back in Yuma, right? The Lishkas Hatlan had sheep in it. Those sheep were used for the carbon tamid. The halacha was that a carbon tamid is an animal that must be examined for 4 days prior to its offering. What happens if you took an uninspected animal and you shechted it for carbon tamid on Shabbos? Shechted it for carbon tamid on Shabbos. So what's the halacha? Chayiv chatos. You're chayiv for violating Shabbos inadvertently, and you require another tamid. Now, Rabosai, this is Rabbi Yossi, but isn't this ta'a b'dvar mitzvah? Is this not an example of where a person made a mistake in the commission of a mitzvah, and yet here Rabbi Yossi is subjecting me to liability? What's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Amrlei bar mina dahi. This case is an exception. I'll tell you why this case is an exception. Daha itmar Allah amrav Shmuel bar chitoy amrav Hamnuna Saba amrav Yitzchak barishon amrav Huna amrav kigon sheviu melishka shinim mevukar. What's the case, Yabosai? They brought a totally uninspected animal. You see, when you bring a totally uninspected animal and you go ahead and you offer that up as a tamid, you're not even in the ballpark of mitzvah. In other words, both say that would be like, for example, if you were to walk out on the first day of Sukkot, which is Shabbos, holding a celery and a lemon, right? Totally got it on sale. Celery and a lemon, right? Would Rabbi Yossi exempt you from liability because you're osik b'dvar mitzvah? No, why not? You're not in the ballpark. There's no mitzvah involved over there. So the Gemara suggests something very interesting. Using an uninspected animal for carbon tamid, that's not even the mitzvah of carbon tamid. Meaning you're so far away from the mitzvah that you can't be called tabid var mitzvah. So essentially what happens is like this. Rabbi Yossi says, tabid var mitzvah, anytime that you are preoccupied with the performance of a mitzvah, and you are preoccupied with with a legitimate performance of a mitzvah, even if you didn't actually perform a mitzvah, but you're in the parsha of mitzvah performance, you will be exempt from liability. But if what you did does not even fall within the framework of mitzvah performance, then ultimately, again, that will not exempt you from liability. So, for example, if you were to shech a totally uninspected animal for carbon tamid on Shabbos, that animal is not even shayach to carbon tamid. That can't be called osek b'mitzvah. That's not called preoccupation with mitzvah because that animal is not even subject to ultimately what to carbon tamid. You go ahead and you eat an ola, because you thought it was a chatas, you're in the ballpark. Ultimately, again, because halacha l'maisa, it's all karbanas. You go ahead and you accidentally carry your lulav out on the first day Yom Tov, which is also Shabbos. That's actual performance of a mitzvah. Those cases, you'll be freed from liability. Good. That's the shita of Rabbi Yossi. Incredible. Mishnah. We'll say incredible Mishnah. Mikabelas isha miyad b'no miyad baila umachzirasa l'mayim b'Shabbos. We'll say, so now we're fast forwarding it. I finished with my lulav. So what could I do? What could happen? I could give a woman, now we'll see why the Mishnah frames this as a woman. A woman could receive the lulav from her son or from her husband and put the lulav back into water on Shabbos. So let's say if you take a look, right, Rashi says over here, Machzir l'mayim, Rashi says, Shelo yichmosh. So apparently, I think sometimes we're used to like these people often will take their hadassim and their aravas and wrap it up. Again, apparently, Bismana Gemara, they used to put the entire lulav back in water as well. So you could put your lulav back in water. You could give a woman could receive the lulav from her husband, from her son, and put it back into the water on Shabbos. Rabbi Yehuda says, B'Shabbos machzirin, on Shabbos you're allowed to return the lulav to water. B'Yom Tov mosifin. Now we'll say, what this means is as follows. On Shabbos, you can go ahead and return the lulav to water. What can't you do? You can't add water. All right, now the reason for that is because the act of adding water will have the appearance of tikkun mana, Rashi says, like you're fixing something. So in other words, if the lulav is already in the water, returning the lulav to that same water doesn't have the appearance of what we call tikkun mana, right? Fixing something. Adding more water has the appearance of a more restorative process, and that's called tikkun mana. San Shabbos, you can return to water but can't add water. B'yam tiv mosifin, on Yom Tiv you're even allowed to add water. Ubemoed machlifin, on Chalamoid you could change the water. Right? So Shabbos you could return, not add. Yom Tiv you could return and add. Chalamoid you could return, add, and even exchange the water. Once a child knows how to shake the lulav, ultimately again he is chayiv to go ahead and take the lulav. Now I will say of course we'll point out that halacha l'maisa, when we say that a katan is chayiv, it means the katan is chayiv midrabanan, and that chayiv, of course, is not on the katan. What that means is the parent has an obligation of chinuch, has an obligation of to educate the child as soon as the child knows how to perform the mitzvah. But I'll say, I point out something interesting over here. If you look at Rashi says over here, b'moed machlifin, b'chol shoed mitzvah lahachlif. On Chalamoid, there is a mitzvah to exchange the water of the lulav, right? So on Shabbos, I can put it back, but I can't add because it's tikkun mana, right? It looks like I'm repairing something. Yom Tiv, I can go ahead and even add, and Chalamoid, I can switch. Rashi just says, not only in Chalamoid can you switch, but you have to switch. It's a mitzvah to switch. But said this is actually a very important halacha in general. Kind of what ends up happening to over Yom Tiv is by the time you get to Chalamoid, right? My Aravis, like they're not even on the cholim list anymore, right? They're off the cholim list. That's how bad it looks. Let's say there is a mitzvah to make sure that our daled minim remain hadar over the entire course of Yom Tiv, right? That's why Rashi says over here, mitzvah lahachlef. Okay, so sometimes it just means, we have to get an extra set of aravos, extra set of adasim. But the idea is that really the hidra aspect, although biblically one might not require it, but certainly the mitzvah really demands that the daled minim look beautiful over the course of the entirety of Yom Tiv. That's why Rashi says that on Chalamoid, there's a mitzvah to switch the water. Keep the daled minim looking fresh. That's a good thing. Good, says the Gemara. So pshita, so we'll say, so ultimately, again, why does the Mishnah have to say that a woman is able to receive the lulav from her husband or from her son? Why a woman? So the Gemara says, pshita, so it's obvious. Well, of course a woman could receive the lulav from her husband or from her son. Ma'odetema, hovi yishala bas chayuvehi, ema lo tekabel. But say, I'm going to throw as follows. Listen to this. I'm going to thought, remember, is a woman mechuyeves in lulav and esrog? No. Why? Mitzvah saseh shazman grama. So the havamina is because she's not chayiv, perhaps for her it is muktzah. Perhaps for her it is muktzah. Kamash malon. That is not the case. Well, see, it's actually very interesting. If you look at Rashi says over imolo tilagabo ika isra tiltal. So the havamina is that maybe a lulav and esrog should be muktzah for a woman. Kamash malon kevam deroy lenetilas anashim toras kli alav umutter betiltal akol. So we'll say this is actually fascinating. So Rashi says over here, it's not muktzah for her. Now, according to Rashi, why isn't the lulav muktzah for a woman? So Rashi says, because since men ultimately use a lulav and esrog, it has the status of a kli. Because it has the status of a kli, it's not muktzah even for a woman. So it's fascinating because there seems to be a much simpler answer. Right? Why isn't lulav and esrog muktzah for a woman? Because even though she is exempt, she can still what? Be able to do the mitzvah. In other words, we'll say, right? So in other words, now what I will point out, remember, is there is a time, of course, where lulav and esrog is muktzah for everyone, and that's when Shabbos. So remember again, we'll see this in tomorrow's daf a little bit more. But now that we don't take lulav and esrog on Shabbos, so remember again, lulav and esrog will be muktzah on Shabbos itself. So again, that's why the Gemara frames it like this: that even though a woman is not mechuyeves, you might have thought it's muktzah for her. Kamash malon, it is not. Good. Katan hayodel ananea. If a child knows how to shake the lulav, he should do so. So we'll say beautiful brisa. Ten Rabbanon, Katan hayodel ananea chayiv belulav. If a child knows how to shake the lulav, he should do so. And again, when we say chayiv, I just want to point out once again, chayiv doesn't mean the child is chayiv. A child is not chayiv in anything. What it means is the parent is chayiv in the mitzvah of chinuch to begin to educate them in the performance of mitzvahs. Lis atef, once a child knows how to wrap himself, chayiv b'tzitzis, he's chayiv to start wearing tzitzis. Lishmar tefillin, if he knows ultimately again how to watch over tefillin. Aviv lokeach lo tefillin, his father purchases for him a pair of tefillin. Yodei ledaber, if he knows how to speak, this is beautiful. Aviv lomdo Torah, once a child knows how to speak, the father says teach him Torah. Ukriya shema, and shema, Torah mahi, what does it mean as soon as a child can speak? I have to teach my child Torah. Mahi, Rav Hamnuna, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morasha kihilas Yaakov. We'll say, what's the first piece of Torah we teach our children? Moshe Rabbeinu has commanded us Torah. Morasha kihilas Yaakov. It is an inheritance. Ultimately, again, for Yaakov, I will say, it always struck me. We're familiar with this Gemara, that this is the first piece of Torah we teach our children. Why this? Why this, right? Why not Bereishis Bralak and Shem Esaretz? Anochi Hashem Elokei Echad, Aseres HaDibros. Why Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe? Morasha Kilas Yaakov. I will say, it's interesting, by the way. What's missing from this pasuk? Well, Hashem, right? Isn't it fascinating that the first piece of Torah we teach our children ultimately, again, is that Moshe Rabbeinu gave us the Torah, it's an inheritance for all. Because we'll say, do you know what the first thing we teach our children? The first nekuda we teach our children is that greatness is within reach. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Do you know who gave us the Torah? A man. A man. And do you know how Moshe Rabbeinu began? Moshe Rabbeinu didn't begin his life with a father who was teaching the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu began his life in the palace of Paro. That's how he began his life. And yet the Moshe Rabbeinu who didn't begin with a father teaching him Torah, ultimately what? Grows up to be lo kambi so kim Moshe od, that you could be anything and everything you want to be in life. Why? Why? Morasha kihilas Yaakov. Because you have the greatest inheritance in the world. Which means, when you have an inheritance, that means something belongs to you because it's within your family, right? It's bequeathed to you. Torah is yours. As much as you have to be kona it, it's not something that's alien to you, that you have to break through in order to get it. It's yours. It's yours. The first thing we tell our children is that greatness is in your genes. The first thing we tell our children is that look at the man who started in the most ordinary way and made from himself something magnificent. And why? Because Kiddusha is your inheritance. Kiddusha is yours for the taking. The first thing we teach our children is not about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not Anochi Hashem Elokecha. It's about actualizing their inherent internal greatness. Because if you believe in your capacity to become great, then ultimately, again, there is no telling what you could accomplish in life. Such an incredible yisod. Kriya Shema Mahi. What do we teach our children in terms of Shema? Pasuk Rishon. That's it, right? So that as soon as a child could speak, we teach them Torah. Torah tziva lanu Moshe morasha kilas Yaakov. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Hayodeh lishmar gufo. Once a child knows how to watch over his body, in order to maintain bodily cleanliness, ochlin al gufo taras. So therefore, again, if his body comes in contact with ritually pure food, you could continue to assume that it maintained its ritual purity. Lishmar as yadav, once a child knows how to keep his hands clean, I don't mean keeping his hands clean like washing, I mean ritually clean. Ochlin al yadav taras. That ultimately, even if he touches taras, you could continue to eat them. Hayodeh lishal. Once a child is old enough that if you ask him questions, he could answer them in a correct fashion, then ultimately, again, then if a safek tuma arises, and it's a safek tuma in Rishus Hayochid, ultimately, again, it'll be tamei. Birshus harabim, if there's a safek tuma in Rishus harabim, sveikotar. That's a general cloud. Rashi points out, we learn from Maseches Sota, that whenever you have safek tuma birshus harabim, the halacha is that it is tahar. Safek tuma birshus hayochid is tamei. We learned that out from Sota. So what it's just saying is a safek is generated when you ask a question and a person can't answer what actually happened. So when a child is old enough that normally you can ask him a question and ultimately again he can answer, as soon as he's that age, then these laws of Safek Tuma B'Rishus Hayochid, Safek Tuma B'Rishus Harabim kick in. Good. Lifros Kapov, as soon as a child knows how to go ahead and duchen, talking about a Kohanic child, Cholkim L'Trum B'Is Agronas. We go ahead and we give him tithes in the greenery. the act of dispensing tithes to a kohen in the granary was a public affirmation of a person's kohanic status. So in general with children, now remember again, a katan could go up to duchen, let's say with his father. Katan can't go up to duchen by himself, but as soon as ultimately, again, the kohen was old enough to go up and duchen, we're comfortable publicly giving him his chelek in a public from the granary. On the base, hayodea lishchot ochlin mishchitaso. This is fascinating. This is really fascinating. Once a child knows how to shecht, right, you can go ahead and eat from his shchita, which is really quite fascinating because this is a child. This is a child, so the Gemara qualifies this very quickly. There's got to be supervision. In general, first of all, if your child's going to shecht, it's good to be there, right? Somebody should be watching the kid. But the idea over here, the Gemara says, is that from a halachic perspective, if the child knows what he is doing, you can actually go ahead and eat from his shchita, assuming that there is an adult supervising above him. Yochol lechol kizayis dagon. Once a child is able to eat a kizayis of grain, marchikin mitza'asa ragla arba amos. This is interesting. Apparently, the waist of a person only becomes, we'll call it quote unquote like offensive enough that you have to distance yourself dalet amas in order to go ahead and daven or learn. Only once a child begins to consume grain, which is interesting. So apparently from a halachic perspective, let's say a dirty diaper, before a baby begins to consume, we'll call it grain products, ultimately does not have the halachic status of human waste. Interesting. That's only assuming that halacha l'maisa, you can eat it b'chtei achilas. The child eats it b'chtei achilas pras. But an adult, so again, when it comes to the waist of an adult, so all of the halachos governing waist, namely that you can't daven or you can't learn within dalet amas of it, apply even if the adult does not eat grain. Bichdei achilas pras. The chsiv is actually interesting. The Yosef das Yosef machol, which literally means, quoting over the pasuk from Koheles, he who increases knowledge increases knowledge, increases his pain. That apparently, again, there's this idea that the older we get, now it's interesting, the Gemara is explaining pain over here, somehow related to the offensiveness of one's waist. So the idea is that, bottom line, is that halacha l'maisa, the waist of an adult, will always trigger the halachos of harchaka, of needing to distance yourself. Whether the adult goes ahead and consumes grain, doesn't consume grain, but with a baby, with a child, only once the child begins to consume grain products does the waist take on the halachic status of waste, and therefore would require one to distance oneself dalet amas from it in order to daven, in order to learn. Of course, once there's an odor, anytime that there's an odor, that by definition triggers the obligation for our chaka for distancing. We'll say in general, by the way, that this pasuk of Yosef das, Yosef macho, is actually an incredibly profound pasuk, right? That when you increase wisdom, you increase pain. I think we all relate to this, that the older we get in life, and supposedly the wiser we become, the more overwhelming and difficult life becomes. Right? So sometimes, again, the simplicity, and this is part of the beauty, it's interesting, it's part of the beauty sometimes in children and in older people as well. That sometimes, when the das becomes a little bit diminished, so it's almost as if the lack of das sometimes takes a little bit of the edge off life. It's an interesting yisod. We think that we become wiser, we become more empowered, and life becomes better. And in certain respects, that's true. Except Shlomo Melech said sometimes the greatest happiness in life is in the simplicity of life. Sometimes when you don't know as much, and you don't know everything, or you don't know everything that you already know, sometimes life just becomes so much easier to live. Interesting yisod. More to talk about that, but a different shir. Yachol lechol kizayis tzli, shilton alevas haPesach. Once a child knows how to eat a kizayis of tzli, of roasted meat, he can go ahead and he could shecht from, he could be included in a chabura for Pesach. Shneimar ish lefi achlo. Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad sheyochal levar achilo. So Rabbi Yehuda says, no, when could he be included ultimately as part of a chabura for Karban Pesach? when he knows how to choose food. What does that mean? Keitzad, nostno tsurar v'zarko, egos v'notlo. When if you put before him, a piece of food and a stone, and he throws away the stone and he eats the piece of food, that's when he's old enough ultimately to be included for a chabura for Pesach. Let's say I just take something very interesting. The Gemara says over here that halacha lemaisa, once the child knows how to go ahead and keep his body clean, his father should get him tefillin. Right? And in fact, I just want to point out, that's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Right? That's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins in Arachayim. Right? He says, the Gemara says lashon over here of once he knows how to go ahead and lishmar tefillin, once he knows how to watch tefillin. But really what it's saying over here is he knows how to watch tefillin, but he also knows how to watch over his body. Because tefillin requires a guf naki. And in fact, this is actually interesting. The Ramah, this is how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. The Shulchan Aruch says in Siman Lamed Zayin Sif Gimel, Katan hayodeh lishmar tefillin betara, chayiv aviv liknos lo tefillin l'chancho. That's how Shulchan Aruch paskins. In other words, that once a child knows how to go ahead and A, watch his tefillin, and B, make sure that he maintains a clean body, his father is obligated to get him tefillin and for him to wear tefillin. So the Ramah comments and the Ramah says, the high katan shu ben yud gimel shana v'yom echad v'chei nago ve'en l'shanas. The Ramah says, but our minhag is, we don't start till the boy's bar mitzvah. Since it's hard to keep a clean body, we don't start until the child is actually chayv. So interesting. So the Mechaber says, Pasuk is like the Gemara. As soon as the child is old enough and mature enough to keep a clean body, watch over his tefillin, his father is obligated him to get him tefillin. Ramah, we wait till bar mitzvah. Now, interestingly enough, the Magen Avraham brings down over here that the minhag today is to even begin 2 or 3 months before bar mitzvah in the wearing of tefillin, right? And the Magen Avraham says, in order to go ahead and get the child accustomed to the tefillin. So I'd say something very interesting. In the Sefer Minhag Yisrael Torah, he quotes that by many of the Hasidim, they don't start putting on tefillin early. They mamish only start at bar mitzvah itself. Why? What's the reason for that particular minhag? I know we don't have time for this, but I just have to tell you this. I think it's so incredible. Listen to this. He says over here that ubanicho as tefillin, when a boy puts on tefillin, right? Margish biyoser ha'ara v'yira b'davar kadosh. Remember the first time he put on tefillin, it's such an overwhelming and beautiful experience. Masha'en kein kishamanichen beis o gimel chadashim mikodem v'arei etzlo kivar kidiyukna yishena. So by the Hasidim they have the following hashkafa that when you do something for the first time, there's such an incredible aura, such an incredible awakening, and such an incredible excitement about it. And then what happens? It wears off. So by the Hasidim hashkafa is that the first time you actually perform the mitzvah, it should be with the highest elevation, the highest level of kedusha. So they dafka wait until the first day that a young boy is actually chayiv in the mitzvah. Because the fear is, if you start a month, 2 months, 3 months beforehand, what happens? You roll around to bar mitzvah, and what happens? You're just like everyone else. Right? And life goes on as usual. Which I will say, such an incredible, there's more to say on this, we don't have time, such an incredible yesod about kind of, and here you only talk about 2 or 3 months. What happens over 2 or 3 years? Right? And this links back to what we saw before, that the whole idea of a mitzvah is that a mitzvah should never become like a masa, should never become like a burden. And how part of our avoda is to keep the freshness, and to keep the excitement, and to keep the love in our mitzvos. Again, because if by the Hasidim they're concerned after 2 or 3 months, the bar mitzvah boy loses the excitement, what happens after 2 or 3 years? What happens after 20 or 30 years? But that becomes our avoda, to keep the freshness, to keep the excitement, to keep the love in our mitzvahs day after day. Hadrun Allah, Lulav Hagazal. New Mishnah. Lulav Va'arava Shisha V'Shiva. Very quickly. We have a whole minute. Good. Lulav Va'arava Shisha V'Shiva. So we'll say again, it's a quick Mishnah. And Howard davens very quickly. So we're gonna be fine. He'll say, so I want to point out over here something very interesting. The Mishnah is going to tell us about when the different mitzvahs of the day apply. So Lulav Va'arava Shisha V'Shiva. So Lulav and Arava. Now we don't know what this Arava is, but what we do know is they circled the Mizbeach of the Beis HaMikdash with the Arava. So Lulav and Arava, sometimes it's 6 days, sometimes it's 7 days. Halal v'asimcha, the recitation of Halal. Simcha, which means the consumption of meat and wine on Yom Tiv. Shmona, that applies for 8 days, because remember, we're including Shmini Atzeres over here as well. Sukkah v'nisach hamayim, sitting in a sukkah, nisach hamayim, which is the water libation, Shiva, 7 days. Hachalil, Chamisha, the playing of the flute, and again, we'll discuss where this comes up, 5 days. Chamisha v'shisha, 5 or 6 days. Lulav Shiva, how do you ever come up with Lulav 7 days? Very simple. Ketzad Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag Shechalios b'Shabbos, if the first day of Sukkot falls down on Shabbos, Lulav Shiva. Then you take Lulav for 7 days, because as we saw before, Midoraisa, the mitzvah of Lulav applies even on the first day of Shabbos. Ushar Kol Yomim Shisha, the rest of the dinner, if Shabbos falls out on any other day other than the first, we don't take Lulav on Shabbos. Arava Shiva, how does Arava come up for 7 days? Ketzad Yom Hashvi'i Shel Arava Shechalios b'Shabbos, Arava Shiva. If the 7th day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbos, then you take the Arava. We'll see what the Arava service is. But if the 7th day, or Shakal Yom Shisha, but again, any other day that Shabbos falls out, you won't take the Arava. Mitzvahs Lulav Kates. Alright, we'll stop over here. We'll pick up Emir Hashem with the mitzvahs. Quite beautiful. This description over here of how we fulfill the mitzvah of Lulav on Shabbos in the Mikdash. Emir Hashem to be continued.